Step 4 in the practice of non-suffering is all about storytelling and stories. What are stories? What are the stories about? Where do the stories come from? And who is telling the stories? Why are the stories at all? Human beings are storytellers. Human beings have evolved to tell stories. People tell stories, not narratives. People do not sit around a campfire and tell narratives about big fish caught at secret fishing spots, or narratives about experiences had in far-off places. And children are not told bedtime narratives by their parents. People tell stories. Stories about the one that got away, or about amazing feats performed. And parents and involved members of a community tell children's stories for education and entertainment. As a side note, it is the child's brain and mind that decide what the takeaway is from the story, not the storytellers. Stories are an essential part of the human experience. Before stories were written down in books, they were spoken at group gatherings around fires. Before speech was invented, stories were drawn in the sand or painted on cave walls, and before that, stories were grunted or told with hand gestures and facial expressions. Storytelling evolved as the best method to transfer information from one individual to another or from one group to another. This transfer of information is essential for social species, such as human beings, to survive and flourish. Our stories have proven to be an incredibly powerful tool for the transfer of information, but stories are an even more powerful tool for the retention of information. Incorporating information into a story will increase the chance that the information is retained and retained for a longer period of time with less effort and energy than a brute force effort to remember information that is not embedded in a story. But stories are so much more. Our identities are stories, both individual identities and group identities. Hopes and dreams, thoughts and memories, and even emotions are stories. Words are stories made up of smaller stories called letters. Living things experience life. To understand these experiences, one has to think about the experience. As soon as one thinks about an experience, one has started telling a story about that experience. Everything one thinks, remembers, explains, or tells about a human experience is a story. Stories are told about actual events, which have actually happened. The stories humans tell are incomplete representations of actual events, but they are lacking information. Human tools such as physics, the earth sciences, cosmology, biochemistry, microbiology, botany, and psychology, and zoology are used to make the stories much more accurate and a closer representation of actual events. The stories one tells about actual events are affected by a million things, like one's understanding of life, one's experiences, one's interpretation of one's experiences, one's state of mind at the time of the interpretation, one's perspective on life, and of course, the stories themselves. As stated in step 2, every second one is limited to 11 million pieces of information, the key word being limited. Even if that number is off by 100% or even 10,000%, human beings do not have the energy, mental capacity, or computing power to handle every piece of information per second from the space the actual event happened in, much less all the information in the town or city it happened in, or all the information in the county or district it happened in. The whole universe is involved in every actual event, and that is a universe worth of information. It is not realistic to propose that a human brain or the whole human species handle that much information. Step 4 in the practice of non-suffering is to understand and appreciate that one's stories and memories are not exact representations of the actual events they are attempting to describe or understand. The stories are incomplete due to one not having all the information about the actual event the story or memory is representing. Our stories are coping mechanisms created by the brain to compensate for this missing information. The brain is constantly filling in blanks, making assumptions, and taking mental shortcuts due to a finite energy supply and computing power. And the conscious mind is constantly telling stories with its 40 pieces of information per second about the conclusions and decisions of the brain. The conscious mind is telling stories about what the brain has decided to do in whatever situation one finds oneself in. And again, the stories are not exact representations of the actual events. Our stories are the ultimate coping mechanism that make it possible for human beings to survive and flourish. Without our stories and habits, human beings would not be able to function in the world. And the stories are always changing. That is why the fish gets bigger and bigger each time the story is told. Today is good or bad, depending on the storyteller, of course. Tomorrow it will get better or worse. And in a year's time, the story of today might be that it is the best or worst day ever. The actual events did not change, only the story has changed. The story of any actual event is always changing because there is always new information that can be added to it. Step 4 in the practice of non-suffering is to use the conscious mind's 40 pieces of information per second explicitly to practice telling oneself a safe, open, joyous, comfortable, and content story. As stated in the overview video, one is good at what one practices. What one practices becomes one's habits. Habits involve very little thinking, so there is more energy to practice enjoying the comfort that is in one's own body. One is good at what one practices. What one practices becomes one's habit. Habits involve very little thinking, so one can, hopefully you see what I'm getting at. Practicing a safe, open, joyous, comfortable, and content story and making it one's own habit greatly increases the potential of one experiencing and enjoying a safe, open, joyous, comfortable, and content experience more often and for longer periods of time, greatly reducing the unnecessary stress in one's body, which in turn will greatly reduce the amount of mental stress one experiences, which in turn will greatly reduce the amount of unnecessary self-inflicted mental suffering. This is the practice of non-suffering. I thank you very much for your time and indulgence. Please enjoy and be comfortable.